Netflix has a sitcom problem. Namely, the vast majority of their original offerings suck. Just a couple of weeks ago, the streamer made a high-profile cancellation of Blockbuster, as it failed to reach Netflix's top 10 in the US following its premiere. This in turn was followed by the uncharacteristically swift renewal of That 90s Show for a 16-episode season 2. Now, while I intend to share my thoughts on both of those shows here in the next couple of minutes, I don't intend to belabor my point any more than I already have. Indeed, I wasn't expecting 2 sitcom videos in a row, but motivation strikes at weird times. Anyway, why do Netflix sitcoms suck? I think the ultimate reason for this phenomenon is likely linked to the very thing that put Netflix on the map in the first place: the ability to stream a single season of television on the day of its release. Just to break that down a little bit further, I think it would be more than accurate to say that outside of a select few series, the vast majority of Netflix originals have a bit of an identity crisis right out of the gate. You see, if an entire season is made available all at once, each and every single one of those episodes needs to be completed before the drop date. This is definitely in stark contrast from the old network days when 22 episode seasons were the norm, with each season playing out over the course of approximately 9 months, and subsequently filming its final episodes while the first in the season were actually premiering. Back then, it wasn't unusual for showrunners and networks to retroactively pivot away from storylines and characters that weren't working earlier in the season in order to navigate towards a narrative that resonated with the week-to-week audience. So at the end of the day, this stringent production schedule of old-world sitcoms allowed for somewhat of a trial-by-fire approach to the debut season that ultimately led to a far better finale and a more refined season 2. And when putting that into perspective, I feel like the binging model for streaming networks is what's ultimately hurting the modern sitcom. Netflix, like most modern day streaming networks, understands that its consumers enjoy viewing shows as fast as possible.
I mean, are you like picking up a vibe or something, Lowe's?
This is technically why companies have shifted towards the 8 to 10, previously 13 episode models, which proved to be more easily consumable than the standard 20+ episode fare of traditional network or cable offerings. These days, audiences don't settle for long, drawn-out, boring content. And with all of the series, apps, video games, and the like, they don't really have to. Additionally, the reduced episode count obviously saves a bucket load of money in upfront cost due to the reduction of episode commitment. But if you ask me, that's pretty much where all of the benefits end when it comes to the vast majority of these Netflix original sitcoms. One of the things that has become undeniably clear in the post-streaming war era is that the vast majority of streaming attention has gone to the classic network and cable shows acquired by some of the biggest hitters like Netflix and Disney. This is obviously a consequence of the binge model that we previously discussed, as a typical broadcast network series has anywhere from 20 to 26 episodes per season, which means that a hit series that ran for approximately 8 to 10 years back in the day would have amassed approximately 200 or more episodes. That's a huge number that likely fuels the sort of comfort TV that plagues so many of us after we're trying to find something new to watch after a long day of work.
If we're done by 11, that'll give me like 3 hours to finish Trout Royale.
And that type of indecision, along with everything there is to watch out there, is what probably drives us to view shows that we've seen numerous times over. All the while, our must-watch lists are slowly growing larger and larger by the day.
What's that one movie, with all the guys in the place and the guys?
Clerks?
Clerks, yes!
Add all of this to a less than transparent explanation of what constitutes a success under the current models, and you have a pretty clear explanation as to what ultimately fuels Netflix's crude and somewhat embarrassing attempts to create new and original sitcoms. All of that's to say that these shows don't simply fail because they're bad. I think the streaming model is somewhat hampering the creative process, creating a stark disconnect between the audience and the creative forces behind a specific project. One which sees a network commissioning an entire season of television without any reliable input from an audience that is likely meant to watch the thing when it comes out, and then pushing out that entire season with a collective runtime of just over a modern holiday movie, and yet somehow it's expected to perform on par with legacy shows acquired from more traditional networks. With all that being said, I wanted to take just another minute to hyper-focus on Ted Sarandos' comments that he made a couple of weeks ago, as I think it pertains to this topic pretty well. With him directly talking about the streamers' philosophy on renewing their original programming, stating, "We have never canceled a successful show. A lot of these shows were well intended, but talked to very small audiences on a very big budget. The key to it is that we have to be able to talk to a small audience on a small budget, and a large audience on a large budget. If you do that well, you can do that forever."
I just blew myself for the first time in 5 years.
Now, the reason I really want to hyper-focus on this is because I feel like it allows us to swing the conversation back to where we originally started. With Netflix's cancellation of Blockbuster, renewal of that 90s show, and what it all means for the reality of modern-day sitcoms made exclusively for streaming networks. Obviously, this quote got the internet riled up, as Netflix has made some rather high-profile cancellations over the last few years. Ones that, even without hard-fast numbers, are pretty strange at best. However, if I can play devil's advocate for just 1 second, I think it's safe to say that Netflix's terms of success is a little bit more straightforward than people are making it out to be. It doesn't seem to be reliant on numbers of minutes watched or days in the top 10 list, but more likely how many new subscribers in particular sign up just to watch that series. It isn't shocking to know that Netflix has the ability to monitor how their subscribers are watching their content. Even though it's clear that they're watching every single day, week, month, or year that you have the service, they're probably way more focused on new subscribers and what they watch after they initially sign up. Obviously, this would be highly indicative of what's actually bringing in new subscribers and what they should push more than not.
Blockbuster on 3! 1, 2!
At least for me, the most interesting thing about this particular analysis is the shocking poll that Hub Entertainment released midway through last year, which seemed to indicate that of the top streaming shows that brought in new subscribers in 2021 midway through 2022, the only Netflix original that cracked the top 10 was The Witcher. Not even Stranger Things made that list, despite the series dominating the streaming landscape over the course of this past year, breaking through niche online bubbles to become a true cultural zeitgeist event in the year of our Lord 2022 of all things.
That was probably not the best way to say it.
On just a bit of an aside here, I think there is certainly a correlation between that study, the release of the streaming numbers for the 4th season of Stranger Things, and Netflix's most recent insistence that they have to figure out how to crack down on password sharing.
The horror followed us, clung to us.
Anyway, I feel like the subscribership data holds just as much weight as any other argument you want to throw out there. And as I previously mentioned, Blockbuster's failure to gain traction with existing customers likely didn't translate into a surge of new subscribers wanting to watch a lackluster offering. On the other hand, that 90s show rocketed to the top 10 over the course of its premiere weekend and comfortably stayed there until its early renewal. And based on the early renewal, indicates a decent return of investment for the streamer. For starters, Blockbuster was a strange, soulless husk of a series, one that failed to capture even the most basic form of nostalgia that one might have for an omnipresent, previous multi-billion-dollar company with generational appeal. For me, it is somewhat hard to really put into words just how bad this show actually was. But if I had to bring things down to the most basic criticisms that I can think of, it would be this. For starters, it's a series that seemingly craves to be about almost anything other than its titular premise. Seriously, I don't understand how a series about people running a movie rental store can have an inventory episode almost entirely about the manipulative nature of the main character's parents. Additionally, I think one of the reasons the show failed is due to the overbearing focus on the store's impending failure. On one hand, I realize that the fear of failure can be a relatable plotline for millions of people, but on the other, I think it somewhat undercuts the ability to escape within the narrative. There's a reason why The Office didn't hyper-focus on Dunder Mifflin's impending failure for an entire season. At least not at the beginning.
Don't you guys think that Blockbuster has its own nostalgic charm and all this stuff might get in the way of that?
This show was an embarrassment. And if I had it my way, I think I would have attempted to structure the series not as a traditional sitcom, but as a semi-reoccurring series akin to those old crack videos.
Look, we don't have to get into a thing.
Look around you, Soren. We are in a thing. This is us
inefficient.
You know, at least for me, I feel like it would have been pretty interesting if Netflix would have structured this as a bi-monthly 15-minute video drop that was allowed to stretch out over the course of several months instead of just a weekend. Basically, I would look at this as a way of Netflix trying to rework the classic sitcom tropes and somewhat anchoring this into a series that was more akin to content creation than something more old-worldy than a sitcom. Basically allowing Netflix to distribute something incredibly cheap to make, but could potentially find a pretty big niche audience. And just personally, I think it would have been really fun to see Netflix attempt to do something like this on a series based off a brand that it crippled due to Blockbuster's inability to adapt to a modern world.
Yesterday I opened a La La Land case and it was just a loose piece of deli meat. Arguably an improvement, but...
I'm just saying, Netflix, this entire episode is about your content lacking, so maybe try to shake it up if you can. Might be falling behind the curve. And moving on to That 90s Show. So when it comes to this series, I have to say, it's fine. It's a series that just barely captures the spirit of the original, but even that's probably due to the inclusion of several key cast members of That 70s Show. But after having sat through 10 episodes of this thing, the only thing it made me want was to go back and watch the original. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that this specific spin-off doesn't seem to have the creative energy of its predecessor. Seriously, as somebody who grew up in the 90s, this show fails to meet a lot of the generational nostalgia that its namesake would imply. And honestly, that's because of the creative forces behind this show didn't actually grow up in that specific decade. Instead, they were too busy reliving their adolescence with their original hit show.
Okay. Really? No.
Finally, with all of that being said, I wanted to swing back around to my initial point on the issues with Netflix's sitcoms or the brand as a whole. You see, one of the quotes that a lot of people are overlooking when discussing that interview with Ted Sarandis mentioned earlier is specifically his assertion of Netflix's brand itself, stating, "We are equal parts HBO, AMC, FX, the Food Network, HGTV, Comedy Central, and Lifetime. You used to have to hunt through 500 channels of cable to find them all, and now they're gonna be on Netflix. The measure of quality is, if you love a dating show, make it as good as The Ultimatum. Make it as good as Love is Blind. There's no difference in prestige quality television in each of these genres as long as they're all well executed." So let's just take a moment and wrap our heads around that. For me, this is the biggest indicator of why Netflix has stagnated in recent years. The streamer doesn't want a specific identity as much as it wants to be a full-scale replacement for television and movie viewership as a whole. The problem is that it simply can't be that, especially in an age where there seems to be more streaming networks than insert analogy here.
I'm guessing that's also how he is with his ladies.
Yeah, it is.
Obviously, Netflix dominates the streaming landscape for now, but it's important to remember that the sheer amount of networks vying for each and every single audience is growing throughout the day, even with all of the turmoil that we saw throughout 2022. And as a result, that stranglehold that Netflix once had on audiences' attention worldwide is slowly eroding, and this streamer has been losing on both fronts, from Wall Street fat cats and audiences alike.
I hope you've saved some money because you're going to need every dime now.
Now, obviously, a lot of the stuff that we've been seeing over the last couple of months is an understood downturn from the heights of the COVID pandemic. But honestly, I would argue that it's actually somewhat of an indication that streaming networks, no matter how culturally appealing their content might be, have a specific cap.
Small businesses offer something the internet can't. Human connection.
Let's face it, Disney Plus, for all of its benefits, is still basically the MCU Star Wars network that just so happens to allow you to pay a nominal fee in order to raise your kids on a month-to-month basis. And still, even with all that going for them, they still lost over 2 million subscribers in the last quarter of 2022. At the same time, Warner Brothers Discovery is going back and forth about what they're going to do with HBO Max and Discovery Plus.
Get out. Get out. Get out.
Netflix, for what it's worth, doesn't have a specific identity under its belt. Ever since it started to create content, it has attempted to recreate every conceivable genre that could potentially pull its own core audience. So at the end of the day, I think Netflix's sitcoms suck, not because of the episode count, not because of how quickly you can watch them, or that they essentially have no benefit of knowing what the audience thinks about the entirety of the show, before it's given to them, but because they seem to be soulless interpretations of products that have come before. And the only reason they're produced is to inundate a fragment of the network's core audience on a week-to-week basis just until the next thing drops. But that's just my take.
The KRW Network.